We talk about piping today. We are going to talk about how to make your own piping and how to use pre-made piping and zips and trims and things like that. And we are going to talk about how to use piping and a few kind of tips and tricks and things. And just remember that I am not a dressmaker and I'm not an upholsterer. I am a bag maker. So all of the tips and tricks that I give you are for bag making. And if you are a dressmaker or an upholsterer and you hear one of my tips and then please do let me know, because it could be terribly, terribly wrong. Although it's kind of too late for me to change my book. So, so I'll teach you what I know. And if you know better, please do tell me. Okay, so I've got some cord. Now I don't have any regular piping cord, so I've got chunky rope that you would get in the DIY store. And I've got pre-made piping, of course it's sparkly. Why wouldn't it be sparkly? And I've got some pre-made piping, and I've got some trim, which I use for my cushion, and I've got some continuous zip, although you can use any zip you like. So we'll talk about the different types of piping that you can use, or different things that you can use. So if you buy piping ready-made, it will usually come in a packet like this, or you can buy it by the meter or by the yard. It's you know, it's fairly similar, whichever one you get. Now it's a little bit hard to see on this metallic one, but on the packet ones you can see they have made the piping for you. So they've got a row of basting stitches in there which holds the piping cord into the piping. Now these ones are cut on the bias. Okay, and that's going to be important. We'll talk about bias and straight in a minute. So if you are buying a packet of piping, just have a look at what length it is and make sure you've got enough before you get started, and make sure you've got enough of the same colour, and obviously continuous, you can just make sure you buy enough. That's no problem. Now you can use trims exactly the same way. So this has got pom-poms. I wonder where the end is. There's the end. This has got mini pom-poms on it, and you would just treat that as though that is the piping cord and this is the not really sure of the technical term, but we're going to call it flange. Okay, when and what's best to use. Okay, well I'll tell you what I know, and if anybody else knows any different, if they could pipe up. Oh my goodness, I think that's so funny. There we go. And then zip as well. So you can use zip as piping. You would just treat this as the flange and this as the piping cord. Great. Okay. So let's talk about what we've got. Oh yes, and this cord. This is not piping cord. This is just cotton rope. And to cut this, you would wrap a bit of sellotape or some sort of duct tape around where you want to cut. So wrap that on and then cut through half it so that it doesn't start to unravel. Okay, now I use this in my book. There's a project called the Pipe Tobo, or the Chunky Pipe Tobo. Can't remember, it was a while ago, and I've used this for that. It's a real statement piece. You would usually only use maybe 3mm or 4mm cord for piping, unless you want a statement. You know, there's nothing wrong with a statement, as long as it's a good statement, obviously. So these are your options for piping. We're going to use this bit of metallic cord later. Now, the key here is that you need to pre-steam everything if you don't want wonky piping. So I didn't pre-steam this when I used this on my cushion because I thought that might melt a bit. So we'll just ignore that for a minute. But with the cord and the pre-made piping, before you use it and before you cut it to size, get it out of the packet and just steam this whole thing. Because this is likely to be made of cotton, and there's definitely going to be cotton rope inside, I bet. So it's 55% polyester and 45% cotton. You do not want that to shrink after you've applied it to your bag or your project. Okay, you want any shrinking to happen before you apply it, so that you make sure you get it not wonky. And the same if you're making your own piping, which we'll talk about in a minute. Pre-steam your cord and pre-steam your fabric. Just save yourself a headache. You know, if you know it's going to shrink when you apply steam to it, and you know you're going to press your project to get a good finish, because that, you know, that's sort of the basics of getting a good finish, isn't it? Just pre-steam it beforehand. Reduce your surprises. Okay, some surprises are good. Shrunken cord is probably not a good surprise. Okay, so get these out of the packet, pre-steam them. Don't worry too much about this cord on the end flattening. It will soon puff up again as you're using it. Okay, so get these out of the packet, pre-steam them, and you're ready to go. Easy, job done. Bob's your uncle. Do you say that anywhere else, or is that just a British thing? Might be a British thing. Okay, so let's talk about making your own piping. So we're going to use some of that cord in a minute, but I've got it pre-cut and pre-steamed because it's really hot today. So all of the traditional rules say that your binding should be cut on the bias. And you know, I am really bad at following rules. Yes, sorry Sue, I do steam with an iron. So you can either hold the fabric or the cord, or leave it on the ironing board and just hold the iron above it and do a shot of steam all the way along, or you can use a pressing cloth, or you can just steam directly on it. You can press directly on it. The rope that I've used, I'll show you when we get there. I've steamed that and it hasn't sort of flattened or anything. It puffs up quite nicely. So I am not a very good rule follower, as we've discussed. So if I'm piping a straight piece of fabric, so maybe the sides or a cushion, I don't bother with bias strips, because I know I'm not going to have to curve around a corner, I'm not going to have to bend, I'm not going to have to stretch, and it saves fabric. So I just cut a straight piece of fabric for my binding. For my piping, sorry. And you can see there's no stretch in this really. That's just a regular piece of fabric. And that's fine if you're making piping for maybe the top edge of a pocket or a cushion, or, you know, something else that's straight. It's not going to have to go around a curve. And don't tell any sewing tutors that I've said you can do that, because I think that's probably some kind of cardinal sin or something that's probably quite naughty. But yeah, so that's what I do. So if you're short on fabric or you're doing something on a straight edge, just cut a straight piece of fabric, because you don't need the stretch. But if you are going around a curve and you do need the stretch, then you will need to cut on the bias at a 45-degree angle. So here's a piece I've cut, and you can see that that's quite stretchy really. And as you go around the curves, you can see how that's stretching round. Okay, so this piece folded over, it's got no stretch at all. That's fine for a pocket top or a straight edge. If you're going around a curve, you do need the bias, you know. Okay, now what width to cut? Strictly speaking, you should, using a fabric tape measure, wrap it around the cord to find out how big that is, and then add on whatever seam allowance you want for the piping. So that would be your flange, and don't forget to double it, because you've got it wrapped around and 2 pieces of fabric on the flange. But generally I think it's always safer if you cut slightly bigger and then trim it down to size afterwards. So for this I've cut it at 2 inches wide, and I'll just make it and then cut it down to size. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to make piping with the bias, and I'll show you how to cut on the bias if you don't already know. If you're a quilter, you probably already know. If you're a dressmaker, you probably already know, but let's just cover all of it, and then hopefully it will take the fear from piping away. Okay, so firstly you get your piece of fabric. As you can see, here's one I made earlier. Ta-da! And then you get a ruler, and they usually always have a 45-degree angle marked on them. And let me think, that's not how I did it, is it? It's got to be this way. So you line up the edge of the fabric with the 45-degree line. And then you, using your rotary cutter, whiz along there. And that gives you this straight edge, which is on the bias. So that's 45-degree angle. Okay, so when they make fabric, they do a warp thread, which goes up and downy all the way along, and a weft thread, which goes side to sidey. And that's how they weave the fabric, you know, warp and weft, warp and weft. Oh dear, sorry, that's confused my camera. But then the bias is the 45-degree angle, which has got a natural stretch to it through the warp and the weft threads. Okay. Oh, I sound like I know what I'm talking about, don't I? So you, if you're making a large amount of piping, you probably want to do this on a large piece of fabric, obviously. But you pop your ruler on the, you pop your 45-degree line on your ruler on the bottom edge of your fabric, and then you whiz along, and that gives you a nice 45-degree cut. And then to cut your width, you turn it around and line up the straight edge of whatever width you want on the 45-degree angle cut. So I've made mine 2 inches. So I've lined up the 2-inch line with the angled cut, and then you just whiz along that with your rotary cutter. And that gives you a piece of bias tape, bias fabric, or, you know, piping, I don't know, piping fabric maybe. Who knows? There's probably a technical term for it. Okay, so that is what we're going to use to make our piping cord. Now, if you have pre-bought piping, where's mine? Pre-bought piping, you may be able to see the 45-degree angle on this. If my camera will pick it up. You can see that it's got the stretch in it already. Let's try a bit further down. Okay, so that's already got the stretch in it. So pre-made piping is cut on the bias. Can I get it to focus? Yeah. Okay, so we've cut our bias strip for our piping. We're going to make some piping. Okay, so you will need a piece of bias fabric, or your piece of piping fabric. Remember, if you're doing a straight edge, just cut a straight piece. Save yourself the hassle. And the fabric, okay? And you will need your cord. Now, as I said before, this is really, really, really chunky. This is just rope from the hardware shop. So, but you know, we're in lockdown, and I didn't think it was an essential trip to go and buy some piping cord. And what you are going to do is, on your piece of bias fabric, you are going to draw a line using a fabric marker or a piece of chalk or something that's not going to show through. I'm using a pen so that you can see it. Draw a line in the middle of your fabric. Okay, and so mine is 2 inches wide, so I've drawn a line at 1 inch wide, 1 inch in. Okay, so I've drawn a line the whole way. Now obviously yours is going to be a lot longer than this if you're doing a bag or a cushion or something like that. If you're doing a bag or a long length for a cushion or something, you may not wish to use double-sided tape because of the cost, because it's, you know, everything costs, doesn't it? You can also use pins, or you can use clips or something else, but the way I do it, because I don't like a lot of shifting, I just draw a line down the centre. Sorry, do tell me if you can't see, okay? And I've pre-steamed my cord, so you can see it hasn't flattened it at all. It's still quite nice and chunky. And I'm just going to draw, pop a line of basting tape down my centre line there. And this is purely and simply just to hold the cord in place. Okay. 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 And then pop your cord. Now my cord is longer so that you can see what's going on at both ends. Pop your cord in the middle there and just gently smooth it out over the tape. Okay. Now bring one edge down to meet the other. And if you want to, you can also add a line of double-sided tape along the edge there. There is nothing stopping you doing that at all. In fact, let's do that, because last thing we want is for me to go a bit wonky while you're watching me. Okay, now remember not to stretch these edges too much because it is cut on the bias and it will stretch. Okay. Oh, that's far too much double-sided tape. My goodness. Nobody tell the bookkeeper. Okay, so I'm just going to fold that over and match the raw edges. And as I said, I've cut this at 2 inches, so it is a bigger seam allowance than we need. Okay, and just match that again without sticking to the double-sided tape. There we go. And don't worry if you get a few creases in there, they're going to come out when you sew it. Okay, so that is ready for sewing. Now after you've sewn it, you're going to want to measure the depth of the flange there. Okay, so I've got my little seam guide set to 3/8 of an inch, which is my usual seam allowance for bags. So I can see that I'm going to need to cut about 1/8 of an inch off of that after I've sewn it. Okay, so don't panic too much if it's too big. So let's talk about sewing our piping, and then we'll come back to another method of making piping if you're even lazier than me. Well, I can't really say that because I've got the lazy option. So, okay, if you're as lazy as me, we'll say. Right, so on my machine, which is my trusty HD9, I have got my adjustable piping / zipper foot. Can everybody see that okay? Okay, now I've got one here, which is, this one's for a Singer, but it's very, very similar. If you haven't already got one of these for popping in zips, I would recommend you get one. And it clips onto the side of your, I don't know, uppy downy bit, what was the name? Shank, there we go. And it has a little cutout on either side, and that's for the needle. Okay, and on the back there, there's an adjustable screw. So the idea is that you loosen that and you screw this onto the shank of your machine. And then you lower your needle very, very, very slowly and work out where the needle hits. And you can move this part at the back. Okay, and that moves the foot in relation to where it is on the shank. So you can attach it to the shank and then see where the needle hits. And ideally, you want the needle to hit right on, let me see if I can get it close enough for you to see, right on that very edge of that little cutout there. Okay, so you would pop this on your machine, lower the foot first, lower the needle, see whereabouts it is, lift the foot up, just adjust it slightly, just unscrew that bit and move it backwards and forwards. Okay, make sure that you get your needle right on a very edge with this little cutout, and then you can tighten the screw at the back and that will hold that in place. So I've already done mine on my machine, so you can see possibly, turn the light on, that the edge of this foot is exactly where my needle falls. Okay, and I'm using bright pink thread today so that you can see what's going on. So if I do any wonky stitches, you'll have to be kind to me. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to sew our piping, and you just pop that under kind of close-ish to the piping, but far enough away. Okay, that you don't want to sew into the piping cord. That wouldn't be a great idea. Okay, and what I tend to do is I tend to pull back on the piping, as you can see with my fingers. So pull it back so that it's out of the way and I'm getting as close as I can. Okay, so you can see my basting stitches there. Can you see my basting stitches actually? Let's move the camera down a little bit. Okay, now you don't want these basting stitches to be shown after you apply the piping. So don't do them as close as you possibly can. Although I have heard lots and lots and lots of advice saying do them as close as you can, but I don't, because I worry that I might never cover them up. Okay, there's a chance for getting closer later on. Okay, so just take it slowly. And there we go. So I've sewn my row of basting stitches in, and it's fairly close to the piping cord, but there is still a little bit of wiggle room there. Okay. Now you would do yours in a complementary colour, just in case you couldn't get as close and those stitches were showing, but I'm doing mine in a contrasting colour so that you can see really easily. Okay, so that's how you make piping cord. Piping. Let's take you back. So, right, so this is how you make piping. Now, if you're doing piping on a bag and you're going to join it, so it's maybe a gusset bag and you're going to go all the way round the panel, is cut a bit of the rope or the cording out of this piping on either end. Now you might not know how much piping you need until you're actually applying it to the bag, so always do a bit more. You can cut a little bit of the rope out of there, or the cord, because obviously you're not using rope because you're doing it properly. You can cut a little bit out of there so that when you apply your piping, that bit, there's no cording in there at all. And as you come to the end of your panel, let's pretend that's a lot bigger than it is, you can crisscross them over without the bulk of two lots of cord. Okay, so you would cut it out of both ends so that they can cross over and you don't have an unsightly join maybe in the bottom of your bag. Okay, is that clear enough? Okay. Right, so that's how to make piping the regular way. Well, I say regular way, it's not very traditional because I've probably broken a lot of rules, so I do apologise. The other way you can do it is to get a product which is designed to make piping. Okay, so this is a wrap and fuse piping by Clover. I don't believe this exact one is still for sale, but they do a few different ones. So if you can find fusible piping, this is what it is. Okay, and this gives you the instructions on how to use it, and inside it tells you what size to cut your fabric and how to do it. Okay, but I'll give you a quick overview. So I've cut my fabric to the width that it says. And then this is what you get inside. So it's basically a length of piping cord with, I guess, a kind of wonder webby fusible, double-sided fusible wrapped around it. So it's almost as though they've created fusible piping for you. Instead of making it out of the fabric, they've made it out of the fusible, and they've fused that onto the rope. I don't know how they do it. I think they may be, I don't know, some kind of witchcraft or wizard. Oh no, it's got basting stitches. There we go. No witchcraft involved. Okay, so the only problem with this is it comes on a card like this, and as you can see, there's little kinks and creases in it. Unfortunately, you can't steam that out. So do be prepared that once you fuse it into place, it may shrink at a different rate from your fabric. Okay, I haven't ever had a problem with it, but just in case. And again, what I did was I drew a line down the center and popped that into place, and then just fold it over. And in theory, the edges of the fusible match the edges of the fabric. Then to fuse it into place, they recommend that you pin this to the ironing board. Now you want to use a glass headed pin or a pin that doesn't melt, and they recommend that you pin as close to the cord as possible, through the cord and into the ironing board. Let's see if this works for my trim. Let's pretend that's the ironing board. So you would just pin it all the way along, and then you can go along with the iron and fuse it into place. It's probably not very helpful, that. Okay, so this is the instructions on it. So you've got your fabric wrapped around your cord, and you pop a pin in at an angle into the ironing board, and then you fuse it into place. And you end up with this length of piping, which is it's pretty sturdy actually once it's fused into place, and it's all in place, and there's no basting stitches, so you don't have to worry about getting directly on those again. Okay, and you can make this as long as you want, really. This one was let's see, 6 yards, so that's 5.5 meters, and it's pretty good if you are as lazy as me. So that's another option for piping, on how to make piping. And you could do it on a straight piece or a bias piece again. Right, so let's talk about using piping. Are there any questions on making piping that I can answer before we move on? Okay, try not to be too scared of it. Remember when you, before you sewed your first zip maybe, and you were a little bit nervous of that. Give it the same tools as you use for zips. A bit of double-sided tape and a adjustable foot, and hopefully that will take the fear out of it. You can always practice making piping before you actually get started.